Good evening. Thanks so much for being here. You know, we have a few seats up in the front, so if anyone's in the back row and wants a better seat, there's about a dozen seats in the first two rows, so please come forward if you'd like. Thank you for being here. I'm Michelle White, curator at the Menil collection, and we're happy to have you here. So tonight we're pleased to welcome Patrick Feaster, media historian here from Indiana University, who, by the way, is a 3-time Grammy nominee, which is so fantastic. And if you happened to come by earlier tonight at the bookstore, we had a book signing of Patrick's book, which is Pictures of Sound, and this is the book along with the recording that was nominated for the Grammy. So if you missed the book signing, Patrick has kindly signed lots of extra copies, so when the bookstore opens tomorrow and later this week, please come by and get a copy. It's beautiful. So this project's organized in association, of course, with a project by artist Dario Robleto, The Boundary of Life is Quietly Crossed. And as you know, in this project, what he's brought together is two fascinating parallel histories, the history of the space race and the history of the creation of the artificial human heart. And in the process, he's woven together a human narrative that's as poignant as it is powerful. And as we will discuss tonight, one that really converges with the great mystery of sound itself. I'd like to first thank the Mitchell Center for the Arts at the University of Houston, who's partnering with us on this program, and director Karen Farber and her staff. It's been a pleasure working with you and doing this together for such a fantastic series of events. And together we also funded a joint research residency for the artist over the course of a year leading up to this project, and also which led to this commission. So thank you. I'd also like to thank the generosity of those who have supported this exhibition and programming. Thank you to Chinwe and Eddie Allen, Robert Cart, MD, and Carol Kramer, Jerry Ann and Holland Cheney, Allison and David Ayers, the Brown Foundation, Anne and Jack Mornier, Bridget and Patrick Wade, and the City of Houston. So before I begin and introduce Dario, I just want to say we have 2 more events related to this program that I hope you can come to. The next one will be on November 18th at 6:30. We will be screening this fabulous documentary from our archive called Man and Machines, and it's about a 1969 exhibition that took place here and at the Museum of Modern Art called The Machine, a Scene at the End of the Mechanical Age. And it sort of weaves together the idea of art and science so beautifully. And finally, on December 2nd, we will have Mimi Schwartz here to speak. And Mimi, of course, is the executive editor of Texas Monthly, and as an outgrowth of Dario's investigation of this incredible story of the artificial human heart, she's writing a book about this story, and a story that largely takes place here in Houston. So she'll be presenting her work. So thank you so much, and please help me in welcoming Dario Robleto.
Thank you for that introduction, Michelle. So one of the great joys of being an artist, of course, is being able to participate in the creative act. But another joy that my particular practice has afforded me is that I've had to become a student of the history of creativity itself. And that means creativity in any form it chooses to take, whether art, science, history, engineering, the history of mourning rituals, etc. But as useful as those categories are, the world is just filled with incredible objects and stories that don't always fit squarely into the assigned categories we like to use to explain them. Because sometimes there's such a perfect blending of material, process, and potential meaning that certain gestures transcend any one field they may have originated in, and you need multiple lenses to view it through. Like arguing the artistic merits of a new artificial heart design how sculpture could aid in neuroscience, or how something as seemingly simple as the craft of braiding hair can speak to the psychology of loss. We become so rigid in our categories that having these discussions don't always feel intuitive, and I think we not only lose an interesting discussion by our inability to speak about these gestures through other lenses, but I really, as these examples show, I really believe there are certain gestures in other fields that cannot be understood unless we use multiple lenses. So I'd like to briefly share with you why I feel the work of our guest tonight hovers in this fertile and complex space that transcends any one category. It is not only brilliant historical research and science, but also, I would argue, brilliant art, even philosophy, because of how it complicates and even upends something fundamentally human, our awareness that memories erode with the passing of time. As human as this awareness of passing time may be, it is equally human to want to resist this potential erasure by never closing the door to the possibility that we can still access, preserve, and decipher ancient information. And we have been remarkably successful and creative in this quest. There are, of course, things like the stunning deep field images of the Hubble telescope that give us glimpses of the early universe in its infancy, stretching back in time 13.2 billion years, or new advances in dating technology that have recently confirmed the oldest fragment of early Earth at 4.4 billion years ago. And then think of examples in our more recent human time frame that also raise a sense of awe in us when we connect to our past. Anatomically modern humans about 200,000 years ago, possibly the oldest human art 42,000 years ago, writing 5,000, even this incredible attempt at preserving a child from 6,500 years ago. And in these examples and many others, great effort has been made to delve ever more deeply into the distant past, hoping to resurrect clues of what we were that time has not completely eroded away. And for the most part, we are able to determine things about the past because the evidence of the event exists in a material form that has been recorded or preserved through time. A light wave, a fossilized bone, or carved stone. But you will notice there is one type of access to the past that is not accounted for here: live sound. This is because for almost all of recorded history, we simply have not known how to record sound, and there appeared to be no natural phenomena that have captured sound over time. So prior to Thomas Edison's game-changing invention of sound recording and playback technology in 1877, the ephemerality of sound waves meant that they lived and died in the moment of their creation. To record sound before this time meant it appeared as oral or written descriptions or musical scores, never as a repeatable, live, real-time moment that we would associate sound recording with today. So just think about this for a moment. Through the Hubble telescope and light waves, we can inch back in time over Edison's device that changed everything. We can inch back in time over 13 billion years, almost to the birth of the universe itself. But when it comes to sound, we have not been able to break the 1877 barrier less than a century and a half ago. And that is until 2008, when Patrick Feaster and his colleagues dramatically redrew the line in the sand for historical sound by playing back the earliest aerial-produced sound waves from 1857, 20 years before Edison had even invented the notion of playback. In a field where inching back to the supposed cutoff line of 1877 by weeks or days was a major achievement, 20 years back was just unheard of. But to do this not only called for inventive technological approaches, it called for redefining what we even mean when we say recorded sound. And I would argue this was one of those categories where a conceptual leap was made that fully crossed over into other fields. This was science fiction made real as the idea of audio archaeology or prehistoric sound has long fascinated thinkers in notions like sound waves that had been accidentally registered during the turning of biblical era clay pots, or the brushstrokes of century-old paintings, or even the scraped grooves made by glacially compressed rocks as they moved over another hard surface. No one has ever been able to confirm these phenomena, which is what makes Patrick's work all the more remarkable. And while this didn't enter the realm of prehistoric, it's no less startling an achievement anytime new pathways to the past are opened in ways nobody expected. Now we'll let Patrick play for us and explain his amazing accomplishments in greater detail, but I want to stress one more time what a significant moment this is in our broader human history with grappling with the passing of time. The creativity of this achievement is not just about how far back we are now able to hear sound, but equally about the poetry of the prism we choose to conceptualize time through. And yesterday can be as magical as 13 billion years ago if you know where to look. And Patrick certainly has a gift of knowing where to look. And as a passionate lover of music and the nature of sound itself, few things have prepared me for the primal response I felt the first time I heard this remarkable recording. This poetic prism that Patrick has created produced a sense of wonder and awe as it satisfied every emotional, intellectual, and artistic desire I searched for as an artist. It was provocative and radical in its redefinition of what we mean by a sound recording. It expanded one's sense of time and space, not unlike the awe of the Hubble Space Telescope has repeatedly done so over the years. It demonstrated that certain thresholds we once thought were permanent barriers in accessing history are sometimes more malleable and porous than we imagined, and creative breakthroughs are still possible. And I've always felt that any time new pathways to the past are opened, it's an expansion of our emotional empathy through time, when the past is made real in new sensory ways. And then as a sound experience itself, the ghostly, glass-like breakability of this once lost voice Patrick has unearthed reminds us of how intimately sound can embody primal feelings of death and loss. It is an audible experience that never ceases to amaze, and I'm thrilled he is here to share his research with us and to further elaborate on the vital role he played in envisioning the show. So please help me in welcoming our guest, Patrick Feaster.
Thanks, Dario, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for the opportunity to come here and speak to you this evening. I'd like to discuss a little bit this field of audio archaeology that Dario mentioned. Many people like to refer to it as audio archaeology, and I like that term. It conjures up the romance of exposing ancient temples, and also acknowledges the dirty work of grubbing through potsherds and things of that sort, although I sometimes think that it's a little bit less like archaeology, where we're digging up mute artifacts and reconstructing the structure of cities and so forth, and it is like paleography, the study of early inscriptions. But I think the term audio paleography wouldn't have quite the same impact. So I'll stick with audio archaeology for the moment. And I've been involved in it, at least informally, for a large part of my life. When I was a young child, my parents used to take me around to swap meets and auctions and things of that sort. My father was restoring a Model A Ford, a 1930 Model A Ford, and we got most of our furniture from places like that. And on $1 a week allowance, so one thing that I could pick up was old records. And so I did. I built up a collection of these over time and was exposed to them, which really introduced me to them at a very basic level that often people who theorize about early sound and early sound recordings, I find, haven't had that same exposure to the artifacts themselves, to the sounds themselves. And so I was aware that there was more going on here than the sheer recording and reproduction of music, for instance, as profoundly important as that is. For example, one of my very first records was a a circa 1904 disc entitled Reuben Haskins' Trip Round the World in His Airship. So a fictional account, a bit like later radio drama, of a trip around the world in an airship in about 3 minutes, just to give you a sense for the type of material that exists out there. And I didn't think about that again for many years. Went through high school probably without a second thought about very early sound recordings, but later on, finding myself in graduate school in folklore and ethnomusicology, I started thinking about this material again. It seemed to me that there was a rich world there, just as rich as the study of early cinema, and yet nobody was really studying it in that way, as a creative form. And so, as a graduate student in folklore and ethnomusicology, I did my dissertation research on this question of how was it that people first reacted to this amazing possibility that had just arisen of recording sound for playback in some other time and place, something radically new. How did you talk to somebody who is going to be listening to you tomorrow, the next day, 10 years from now? How did you introduce yourself to somebody through the phonograph in a way that would be different from meeting them face to face? How did you sing differently? How did you perform differently? So pursuing questions like this, and it was every bit as rich as I'd expected it to be. And as I got a reputation for being interested in things like that, other people began to come to me with puzzles that they had, mysterious old recordings that they couldn't quite figure out. They thought I might be able to help them research them, figure out what they had, why it might be important, why it might have taken the form it did. So I'd like to start by introducing you just to one example of that. Jerry Fabris, the curator of sound recordings at Thomas Edison National Historical Site, a few years ago, told me about a box of cylinders he'd found with really no markings on it except for one name, Wangemann, which we both knew was the name of a very early recording engineer that Thomas Edison had hired and who introduced the wax cylinder phonograph in Europe. But none of the cylinders were labeled. It was just a box with a number of cylinders, some of which were broken. He digitized all the ones that were not broken, and they had spoken announcements on them in many cases, and some of them were just speech, but it was all in German, and he couldn't understand German, so he asked me, would you give these a listen, see if you could figure out what these were? And I said I'd be happy to do that. And also I had a colleague in Germany, Stefan Puy, who did some work on these as well. Here's just one of those cylinders. Let's see. There we go. I'm a PC person. This is a Macintosh. So here you'll see the transcription of the German on the left and then a translation into English on the right. Stefan and I put this together. The white is in one voice. The yellow is in another voice. So we'll just start off with this as a little piece of historical audio to start getting your ears accustomed to the type of material you'll be hearing tonight. I'll play this and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
Reusau am Schlesien am 21. Oktober 1889. Das neue das Telefon ermöglicht, dass ein Mann, der lange schon im Grabe liegt, noch einmal seine Stimme erhebt und die Gegenwart begrüßt. Diese neueste Erfindung des Herrn Edison ist in der Tat staunenswert. Der Phonograph ermöglicht, dass ein Mann, der schon lange im Grabe ruht, noch einmal seine Stimme erhebt und die Gegenwart begrüßt.
So a number of interesting things going on here. First of all, there's the date, 21st of October, 1889. That's long enough ago that the sheer age of this is somewhat impressive. We have him, the speaker, at first confusing the technology that he's experiencing. He talks about the telephone. He's mixed up, of course. The telephone is that miraculous new invention that'll take your voice and send it across a continent. This is the one that will bottle up your voice and send it through time. And that is ultimately, though, what he's impressed by, the ability of this technology to preserve voices beyond the grave. But whose voice are we actually listening to here? Whose voice have we recovered from beyond the grave? Well, we can find that out. There weren't a whole lot of people making sound recordings on the 21st of October, 1889. This particular event was reported in newspapers at the time. It was rather a big deal. The location, Kreisau in Silesia, it's now Krzyżowa, Poland. This was the home of Helmuth von Moltke, and that was his voice. So this was one of a number of recordings of extremely important members of the German government recorded by Wangemann as part of the effort to promote the phonograph in Europe at this time. And Helmuth von Moltke is a fairly significant historical figure. He was really the main architect of Prussian military strategy in the German wars of unification. So this is quite a big deal just based on who he was. But the thing that immediately struck me the most when I figured out whose voice this was his birth date. He was born in the year 1800. Now, up until this point, the person with the earliest birth date whose voice we could hear was the Hungarian patriot leader Louis Kossuth, who was born in 1802 and made a recording very late in life. Whereas 1802 is the second year of the 19th century. 1800 is the last year of the 18th century. So, as I figured out, and as people were excited to learn, this is the only known voice recording of someone born in the 18th century. Now, Helmuth von Moltke's nickname was Der große Schweiger, which schweigen is a German verb that essentially means to be quiet, not to talk a lot, to keep silent. And so his nickname was Der große Schweiger because he was known for not speaking very much. So I find this a tremendously wonderful irony that of all the millions of people born in the 18th century, his is the one voice we can still hear today. So that's the sort of thing that I do as an audio archaeologist, and I'm not the only one. There are other like-minded people who devote time and energy to this, and here are some of the others. That's me on the left there. Next to me is David Giovannoni, and next to him, Megan Hennessy and Richard Martin of Archaeophone Records. The four of us, back in 2007, had just completed a project working together. It was a CD that was released through Archaeophone Records called Actionable Offenses, Indecent Phonograph Recordings from the 1890s. This was a collection of, as the name implies, indecent phonograph recordings. You may think, oh, this was the 1890s. It couldn't have been that bad. Well, it was. These cylinders had to be bleeped when they were played on NPR. But we'd had a very rewarding time working together on this project. It was a very rewarding collaboration, and we were looking around to see what else could we do together to build on that momentum. And so one idea that came up was, well, let's do a CD of the oldest recorded sounds that exist anywhere in the world. Find out what they are, make them talk and sing. We want to hear these things before we die. Where are they? What are they? And so we began pursuing that together, and it soon became clear that there was more than a CD at stake here, and we formed this loose collaborative of like-minded people called First Sounds. You can look at our website, firstsounds.org, if you'd like to see more about our work. But to drive this work forward. But of course, the question then was, what are the oldest recorded sounds? As Dario mentioned, the phonograph, Edison's phonograph, was invented in 1877. But even that, there really weren't recordings dating back that far, because the initial phonograph made records on sheets of tinfoil that once you took them off the drum, they were very hard to replay. And we have since recaptured a few of those, but at this point, the very oldest sound anybody could hear was from 1888. And so that was really the date to beat at this point. But part of the issue in figuring out what the world's very oldest sound recordings were was grappling with the question, what is a sound recording in the first place? Now, sound recording is a very, very complex process that's based on a very simple principle. You have some object like a membrane, a thin membrane, that vibrates, moves back and forth in response to aerial sound waves, the motion of air molecules. It moves back and forth. Sound is just a vibration, so this is what it consists of. So you take that back and forth movement and you graph it out in some way, like the image that you see here on the screen. And then you take that graph and you use it to vibrate another membrane. And that imparts a new sound wave to the air that has the same characteristics of the sound wave you originally recorded. That's how we reproduce sound. And so there's two parts to this. There's the recording of the motions on the one hand, and then there's the reproduction of the motions on the other hand. And Thomas Edison was the first person to play back a recorded sound in 1877. But he was not the first person to record a sound, and that's what we began looking at for the world's very oldest recorded sounds. And that led us to this gentleman here, Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville, a Parisian topographer and proofreader who invented the device you see on the left here, the phonograph. This was a device that he came up with the idea for as he was reading a treatise on physiology and read about the workings of the human ear. And so he wanted to build an artificial device that could record any sound out of the air in the same way that we detect sounds out of the air physiologically ourselves. So really an artificial ear. The difference is that it writes down the signals that it picks up instead of passing them along to our auditory nerves. So here's how the device worked. You had a funnel, and you'd produce sounds inside that funnel. Maybe you'd stick your head into it, and you'd sing, or you'd talk, or do something like that. Membrane would move back and forth at the end of it, and that would cause a stylus to move back and forth. And at the same time, you'd turn a drum, a cylinder with a sheet of paper wrapped around it and covered with the soot from an oil lamp. So the stylus, which was often something like a human hair or a quill or something of that sort, would scrape away the soot and leave a very, very fine trace of those motions behind. And then when you were done, you'd take the sheet of paper very carefully off. You'd fix it in a series of baths of alcohol, a little bit like fixing a charcoal drawing, and then set it aside. And so that's how this device worked. It's recording sound, much as Thomas Edison's phonograph later would. But the idea here was to make visual records that people could look at and study. Playback was not on the table. It's a little bit like a seismograph that makes records of earthquakes, but there's no expectation that you'd use them to play back an earthquake. I mean, I think if you could use seismographs to play back earthquakes, they'd probably be banned. But again, this was a device like that. But there are no less records of sound for the fact that there was no intention of playing them back. But that was not the idea. And people knew about these. They were covered pretty well in scientific texts at the time. Here's an example of one. And people recognized that this was really the same type of information as the groove on an LP or the waveform that you'd see in audio editing software. And the notion that these could be played back was out there before we got to this. I mean, it was something people had talked about. But the main problem really was that nobody knew of any really good examples. I mean, yes, you could play these back, but it would be a split second of sound. The idea was this was a dry scientific apparatus used to make records of organ pipes or tuning forks or things of that sort. There wouldn't be anything terribly interesting to recover from these signals. You could play this back, but it would sound like something like that. It just wouldn't really, it wouldn't be like Helmuth von Moltke's voice. But in reading about Scott's work, it became clear to me that he wanted to do more with his invention than that. He talked about using it as an automatic stenographer, for example. He thought you'd sit it down between a pair of businessmen and they'd deliberate over, I don't know, a corporate takeover, or whatever they talked about in business offices back in the 19th century, and it would keep a record of what you said that could be read and transcribed. I mean, that didn't work out so well. People can't really look at a waveform as such and decipher it. But nobody knew until they tried. But on top of that, he thought it would be used for recording artistic expression. One of his hopes was that it would be used to record the performances of great actors on the stage, whose artistry usually died with them. You couldn't really recapture the genius of the great actors of yesteryear. He thought his device could record that genius in permanent form. And this is actually an example, we hadn't found this yet at this point, but where he took a text of a play. This is Othello by Ducis. It's a little bit like Shakespeare's Othello, but it's been adapted into French, and Desdemona doesn't die in it. So anyway, it's a French adaptation. This particular passage in English translation runs something like this. So to this faithless rival, Edelmone must have given this diadem. In their cruel rage, our lions of the desert, beneath their burning lair, sometimes tear apart the trembling traveler. It would be better for him, for their devouring hunger, to scatter the scraps of his palpitating flesh than to fall alive into my terrible hands. This seems to have been his favorite test phrase, so it's a little bit like Edison's Mary Had a Little Lamb. But the important thing about this was, even if the phonograph couldn't capture the words in a way you could decipher, it could capture intonations and volume and all the things I just did there, and that's what he was hoping to record. And this is a hybrid inscription he created, taking ordinary writing and superimposing onto it the kinds of curves and squiggles and wiggles that he believed his machine could capture. And so, knowing that this was part of his aspiration, we started looking for recordings he had made. And this was a time-consuming and involved process. It largely involved me slogging through these old French sources and reading them, and then my friend David Giovannoni flying over to Paris and following up on the leads that came up and tracking them down. And it was, at this point, we found 50 of his phonograms in various archives. We've scanned them all digitally. But the real discovery happened in March 2008 at the Academy of Sciences in Paris, where my friend David Giovannoni found a number of quite exciting recordings made in the year 1860 of speech and singing. Very long phonograms, so note just brief blip examples. These are fairly lengthy for phonograms, and the content was very exciting as we were reading these. Like I say, singing and speaking and so on. And so we selected the one that seemed to be most promising and did what we needed to do to play it back. At this point, we were working with a team of researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory who had devised a system called Irene for optically reading cylinders and gramophone discs and other analog media. So you don't even have to touch the surface with a stylus, very useful if you have a very fragile recording or one that's broken or something like that can't be played through traditional means. But their software was adaptable to our purposes, as we found out. So we adapted the scans, we did graphic editing on them, broke it into pieces, sent it to them. They sent us back a file of little snippets. David Giovannoni stitched them back together. And then one afternoon in March of 2008, I got this sound recording by email. You're all wondering what this is going to sound like, aren't you? Don't expect too much just yet. This is the before recording. So, the phonograph was a hand-cranked instrument. So if you can imagine what you'd get if you took your finger, put it in the middle of an LP, and just moved it around erratically, you'd get something that would sound like so to the point that you probably couldn't even make out the melody being sung or anything like that. But the nice thing about Scott's phonograms from this period is he didn't just record the voice. Next to it, he recorded the vibrations of a tuning fork as a time reference. The nice thing about a tuning fork is it vibrates at a constant rate. So if you take this image you see here at the bottom, the top is the tuning fork. Thank you. The top is the voice, the bottom is the tuning fork. If you select every so many cycles of the tuning fork and set it to exactly the same frequency, and you do the voice at the same time, you can correct the speed fluctuations. So he wrote that his tuning fork was 500 simple vibrations per second, so I adjusted it to a 500 hertz tuning fork, stayed up into the wee hours of the morning, and then sitting there at my computer at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, I don't remember how late it was, how early it was, I listened to this, and I was really swept up in the technical side of this. I mean, it was very meticulous, very monotonous work, but thinking about that moment, I did realize, I hope I realized, that at that moment I was the first person living to hear someone singing a recognizable tune from before the outbreak of the American Civil War. This is Au clair de la lune, recorded on April 9th, 1860. Sounded like the voice of a young girl. We thought, maybe Scott's daughter. We know he had a daughter. So that became rather big news. It was interesting to see how different news media in different parts of the world handled it. Here's the front page of the New York Times. Researchers play tune recorded before Edison. In France, 20 years before Edison, a Frenchman invented sound recording. In Germany, sounds like a strangled chicken. And then there was the BBC.
American historians have discovered what they think is the earliest recording of the human voice, made on a device which scratched sound waves onto paper blackened by smoke. It was made in 1860, 17 years before Thomas Edison first demonstrated the gramophone, and featured an excerpt from a French song, Au clair de la lune. The award-winning screenwriter Abby Mann has died at the age of 80. He won an Academy Award in 1961 for Judgment at Nuremberg. Abby Mann also won several Emmys, including one in 1973 for a film which featured a police detective called the character on whom a long-running TV series was eventually based.
It's 10 minutes past 8. Fighting between sheer militia.
So it was nice to see the kind of response that people had to our work. Responses varied quite a lot, but the phonogram that we had played, that we had others as well, but there were some obstacles in our way of doing more of this. Au clair de la lune was a pretty straightforward waveform, and the software that we used really required that every point along the x-axis should correspond to just one value along the y-axis. I mean, that's how a sound recording works. It's a graph. But as we looked through other phonograms, including speech and other subjects, many of them looked a little more peculiar, looked a little more troubling. This really seemed to be more like phonographic calligraphy than the sound recordings that we were used to. And the software that was available to us through Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory really couldn't handle anything like this. It just didn't conform to its expectations. But I did find, finally, another way of trying to get sound out of these so that we could at least hear what was ever there. We couldn't correct for the distortions, but we could at least hear what was there to hear. And this is how it works. So motion picture soundtracks, when sound is stored optically, it's stored in that kind of a track alongside the image track. And the idea is that the sound is encoded in terms of how much light passes through the film at each point in time. Either it can be a strip that's more or less opaque, so where it's more opaque, less light gets through, when it's less opaque, more light gets through, or it can be a band of varying width, so when it's narrower, less light gets through, and it's wider, more light gets through. And there was software that was designed to play back this kind of a sound recording. And so what I did, this is how that software works. Essentially, it goes along and looks at each column of pixels and averages out how bright the pixels are in that column. So here you see on top just a sample of a varying width waveform, and then underneath how it's calculating the different samples based on how much brightness there is in each of those columns. That's how it works. So what I do is I take a waveform, I fill in the top and bottom of the image, run it through the software, add them together, and I get a waveform that looks just like the original image. And it gives pretty good results with nice, unmessed up waveforms. At the bottom there, you see Au clair de la lune from 2008 using the Berkeley software. At the top, you see the results of my method. It came out, I think, a bit more accurately. But perhaps more importantly, it allows us to take really messed up waveforms like this one and get something out of them that we can listen to. And that opened up the possibility of hearing some of Scott's other phonograms, like this one. This is that dramatic speech I did earlier, in French this time. This is, however, also the earliest recording of human speech contours, so the intonations of speech, as recited on the 17th of April, 1860. And the first time I played back a recording of this sort, I played it back at the same speed as Au clair de la lune, and this is the sort of thing I heard. So it suddenly became clear that we'd been playing that one back at twice the correct speed. The tuning fork was actually vibrating at half the frequency we'd thought. So instead of the voice of a young girl, it was really an 1860s version of the Chipmunks. This is this recording played back at the correct speed. So again, this is Scott reciting a piece of a play, and we can hear here that he really is attempting to convey emotion as an actor would on the stage. That's what he's trying to capture here. This is no mere experiment at intelligibility. He wants to capture emotional delivery here. I'm about to do some emotional delivery here. This is like a video game. I'll admit it when I'm licked. That's the same thing you heard before, but at half the speed anyway. But here's Au clair de la lune played at the correct speed. So why did he sing it so slowly? You can see how we were confused at first. Seems like a recording being played far too slow. That is the correct speed. Well, on the one hand, it was an experiment, singing notes very, very slowly. You'd have nice long traces that were easy to decipher. But when I was discussing this with some friends in France, they told me, well, that's how we would sing Au clair de la lune as a lullaby. So we may not have a recording of Scott's young daughter's voice, but maybe we have a record of the way that he sung her to sleep. Having said that, though, I think that this very slow, lugubrious version of Au clair de la lune wouldn't have had the same impact that chirpy little version that went through all the national and international news media did. But at the same time, I felt a little guilty about stealing some magic away from this recording. So I'm happy that there are other recordings of Scott's that are lively and fun. So I just want to share one of those with you. This is the Song of the Bee from a comic opera called Queen Topaz. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a lively performance, full of enthusiasm and happiness and excitement. And this was the last recording of his that we have, the last dated recording of his that we have. And we can use this same technique to play back more familiar formats. The gramophone, invented by Emil Berliner in 1887, this was the forerunner of turntables and vinyl LPs and that whole technology, but all that really is a phonotogram coiled into a long spiral and sunk down in depth so that it can guide a stylus along. And the inventor, Emil Berliner, was really thinking about this invention as based on the phonotograph. He wrote about it in those terms. In some of his early notes, he called his invention the phonotophone, for instance. But some of his very early experiments were just wavy lines on pieces of paper. And this is one example that I found in a scrapbook at the Library of Congress. So it's really nothing more than a gramophone disc, like a vinyl LP, but pressed onto a piece of paper. So this is what I was able to get out of it. This is just an excerpt.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That's all my opinion. Morgen rot, leuchtet mir auf den Triumph. Bei 40 Trompete blasen, dann muss ich mein Leben jagen, wie der Mann Kamerad.
So counting from 1 to 20 in English, laughing, and then singing. To the best of my knowledge, this is the oldest known example of singing in the German language to survive. But up until this point, it's all been a matter of recovering, faithfully recovering actual sounds from many, many, many years ago. But this next example is a little bit different. This is from a magazine, a copy of a disc that was actually used as a printing plate in a German magazine. It's a mirror image, so I'll flip it so you can actually maybe even read it, particularly the date there at the bottom, December 14th, 1889, and then underneath it says R50. And according to his notes at the time, when he wrote something like that at the bottom of the disc, that indicated how fast you were supposed to rotate it when you played it back. Now this is what we get if we play that back at 50 RPM.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25.
So counts in German, then recites the alphabet, and then says goodbye. I sent that to my friend David Giovanni. He immediately sent me back a revised version where he corrected the speed to bring the voice back up to a natural expected pitch. But we know from the accompanying text, Berliner actually meant to make the recording that way as an experiment, a demonstration. As far as I know, it's the world's oldest surviving trick recording. But it was intentional, so he speeds up the rotation of the disc as he's getting to the very end so that in playback his voice will get slower and lower, and so on. So that was intentional. So up until this point, we've been talking about faithfully, accurately recovering sounds from the past. But here's someone playing around creatively with the technology. And after doing things like this, it occurred to me that maybe it was worth trying to play back even some of Scott's recordings where we couldn't correct the speed. It was hopelessly messed up, and yet we can still play it back. And what will we hear if we do? Even if it is not perfectly replayable, we can still not reproduce it. We're not really reproducing a sound faithfully, but the word I like to use is educe, to bring out from a state of latency. And these phonograms date from 1857. About half of Scott's known phonograms are earlier like this. They don't have a tuning fork. We can't correct the speed. They're earlier, though, and they also, to me, are a little bit more interesting because they're so enigmatic. As you listen to this, you're never sure. Are you listening to some subtle feature of a sound that actually existed back in 1857, or is it an artifact of the recording process? I'm not sure. But this is a recording of the human voice singing from the 17th of August, 1857. And we're not even necessarily limited to things that were recorded in the sense we ordinarily think. An awful lot of what passes for sound recording today, electronica and so forth, can be programmed by hand in advance. It's not really a recording of sounds passing through the air at all. And similarly, here's a plate from a book published in 1807, but this plate was dated 1806. Someone had plotted out what he thought a graph of the motions of a molecule of air would look like, using geometrical tools or by hand. I'm not sure quite how we made it, but we can play this too. And we don't have to stop there. There are two formats we can use to display sound recordings as data. There's the waveform up at the top that we've been talking about. But according to the Fourier theorem, you can take any complex periodic waveform and break it down into its component simple frequencies and their amplitudes. So that's what's being displayed here at the bottom. It's not a graph of time against amplitude, it's a graph of time against frequency. And we can play those back, too. It's a different process. Here's an illustration of how it can be done digitally. You just, again, check out the brightness of each pixel, and you generate a sine wave at the frequency it corresponds to, at the amplitude corresponding to the brightness of the pixel, combine them all together into a complex waveform, and you've essentially played back the sound spectrogram. If you didn't follow that, maybe it's easier to make the point with an actual example. Here is a 1947 spectrogram of someone, according to the inscription, saying, "She was waiting on my lawn."
She was waiting at my lawn.
So, seems like a pretty legitimate playback technology, right? Even to the point that we can tell the caption is wrong. She says, "She was waiting at my lawn," not "she was waiting on my lawn." So these only go back to the 1940s. That's when the sound spectrogram was invented. But inscriptions that we can treat as graphs of time against frequency and that we can play in the same way date back a good deal earlier. Here, for example, the term that I give to this technique is paleospectrophony. Paleo for old, dealing with old inscriptions. Spectro, because I'm dealing with spectral data. And phony, because it's authentic. So here's another example from 1934. So this was not done by a machine, not done by a sound spectrogram, but it was done by someone carefully measuring and doing mathematical analyses of a sound recording. And he published this plate in a scientific journal, an acoustics journal, of someone reciting the phrase, "Joe took father's shoe bench out." Of course, this is 1934. There was no way to play this back at the time, so he never really knew how well he had done. But I can play it back today. So here it is. Joe took father's shoe bench out. Let's hear how he did.
Joe took father's shoe bench out.
Not bad for 1934. But this can go back a lot earlier than that. Any inscription that we can treat as a graph of time against frequency, we can do this to. So here's a plate showing how to pin a barrel organ, published in a book by Athanasius Kircher in 1650, played in exactly the same way as that "She Was Waiting at My Lawn" recording. So this is played using the exact same method, even though this was drawn by hand. The playback, if you will, is the same. Want to push it back a little bit further? Medieval musical notation. In many cases, we can treat in the same way. Here's an example of Dasean notation. This is the oldest tradition of writing polyphonic music in the Western tradition. This particular manuscript is from about the year 950. So that is an automatic playback of an inscription over 1,000 years old. Not a recording. It wasn't recorded out of the air or anything like that, but nevertheless, playing it based strictly on the marks on the page. This is not really a performance, not a synthesized reenactment or anything like that. So this all came out of those efforts to play back phonautograms, but I tried pursuing these techniques further to see just what kinds of inscriptions could we bring back to life if we pushed that to its furthest limits. And throughout that, I think there is a question to be raised here about what is a sound recording itself. Because if, say, a piece of electronica that is not recorded out of the air is accepted as something like a sound recording, then why not these? I'll just leave that question with you. I don't have a good answer to it, but I think it's a provocative question. So that's where I was a few years ago in terms of thinking through these processes. When I was working at the National Museum of American History as a Lemelson Center Fellow, studying the very old sound recordings that they have there, connected with research done by Alexander Graham Bell and his associates. And at the same time I was a fellow there was another fellow working at the Smithsonian, a fellow possibly known to you named Dario Robleto. And I'll let him talk a little bit about what he was doing there and how we ended up coming together.
So wasn't that incredible? Yeah, I'll use it. So, as you see, Patrick transcends categories. And as an artist, when I meet someone like Patrick or I'm aware of his work, how could you not be moved as an artist? Everything's clicking in the mind with this type of work. And this is why I think it's so important for artists to have these conversations with people in other fields. And in the process, we can push each other in totally unexpected areas, which I'd like to tell you somewhat about. So how does this all relate to the show here? Well, Patrick, I've been keeping my eye on him for a while, and I was thrilled to find when I was at the Smithsonian that he was there as well, doing other work. And I immediately sought him out to try to begin this conversation. I'm not sure what you thought of me at first. I've never asked you what that initial moment was like, but obviously he's here, so that's good. But what Patrick did for me as an artist, he opened up this whole other possibility about the history of the heart. And, sorry. Oops. Because the thing that I was invested in at the time, which many of my friends here, I'm sorry, you've heard it many times, but it is a story of the Voyager, and there's an incredible story of a probe that was launched in 1977. And on board is a very famous record called the Golden Record. And Carl Sagan had been asked by NASA to put together an interstellar message to place on board this probe, just in case any intelligence ever found it. And the reason they did that is because they knew that this would be one of the few human-made objects that would ever actually exit the solar system because of the particular trajectory it was on. There's only 4 objects that have ever obtained this distinction. I've been mesmerized with this story since I was a little boy. In particular, there's one recording on it of a woman named Irene, Carl, who was a team member Carl had chosen as the creative director of the record. And they happened to fall in love, madly in love, while they were working on this record. And in her incredible state of giddiness of being in love, she asked Carl, just a few days before they had to turn in the master tapes to NASA, with this record that's a document of what we were, filled with language and music and images, all kinds of beautiful things. But there also happens to be the electrical recording of the brain and the heart of a 27-year-old woman who had just fallen in love 2 days earlier. And I'm so glad she did this, but essentially she snuck on board the concept of human love as a thing that once existed in the universe, and if something ever found it, it would be there, just with all the other things that make us what we are. So it's a really beautiful thing she did, and I've always wanted to contribute to that story in some way. And the way that I felt I could we tell the story of how did we get to that day in 1977, where Anne could not only record herself through the technology of an EKG machine and an EEG machine, but why do humans think something as specific as falling in love is literally in the waveform? Not as a metaphor, because Anne didn't send this as a beautiful metaphor, although it is. She sent it to work. And we have a lot writing on the fact that it would work. If it's ever found is a whole nother question. But I wanted to be able to update the story in some way and offer to Anne a possible answer that maybe this would work. And Patrick's work, as you can probably see the connections, of the beauty of being able to pull information out of our own history that nobody thought we could pull usable information out of. This is the plight of the Golden Record, essentially. I think what beyond the other beautiful things he's doing in microcosm what I think the Golden Record will face one day, which is, can you pull useful and emotionally meaningful information out of the waveform and turn it back into something recognizable? So to me, there's such a hopefulness in what Patrick does that if we can do it on our own planet with our own history, maybe there's a shot it can happen with the record. So that began our conversation about what is the history of the human quest to record the heart and the mind. And it turns out Patrick was very aware of a parallel. We're still quite not sure if they were influencing each other or if this a rare moment where two solutions occurred independently. But essentially the history of the heartbeat is the history of recording sound as a visible image, which Patrick is an expert on. So he opened the door to an actual discussion about hearing the earliest hearts and pulses ever recorded, also decades before the invention of playback had even been invented. So this is one of our, I thought we'd talk a little bit about some of our detective work in finds. And this is one of the most incredible ones, if you want to remark on this one. I will never forget when you called to tell me what had actually made the tracing in the soot.
Yes, well this is an example, the first published example of a pulse tracing of the pulse of a human being. Up until this point, there had been recordings of pulses, but none of them were humans, mainly because to record a pulse up until this point, you needed to partially dissect the subject, and I guess there were no volunteers. This was in 1853, and just to repeat this point, we're not sure of the possibility of mutual influences here. Leon Scott, who invented the phonautograph, first came up with the idea in 1853 or 1854. Carl von Vierort, who came up with this technique, which is basically equivalent to using a modern pressure cuff like they'd use to take your blood pressure, but recording those impulses, that's also 1853, 1854. The recording technique is the same. They're both using moving surfaces covered in soot, which, as far as I can tell, was new to that moment. So the chances of those both arising at that precise moment with no mutual influence, I think there must have been a connection. But this is the very first recording that was published, made on that machine, and it was traced in soot using a human hair.
As a stylus head. So, yeah, the first time a human saw their heart moving over time was traced by a single hair and residue from a candle flame that burned over a century and a half ago. It's one of the most, as an artist interested in materials and meaning, it's hard to top this one. As far as what can you expect from a line? I mean, it's like a basic art question of how much meaning can be embedded in a simple line. And this one has quite a bit. But then the challenge of what you had already figured out with the voice, could we apply it now to the heart and the pulse?
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
Let's wander back over here.
Back to my
oh, yes. So I was trying to think about how best to play back the pulse records. I mean, one possibility would be to use it to vary the pressure on an actual liquid so you could feel the pulse or something like that. But doing it as sound had a lot of advantages to it. And I had done some earlier work with a similar phenomenon. This is a trace made by Barlow's logograph. This was a device first unveiled in 1874 that didn't record sound, but it did record speech, or it was presented as recording speech, as breath impulses. Essentially, if you think of the things that we try to avoid if you're popping peas, that's what he was trying to record. So I thought, well, we could use a similar technique to paleospectrophony to convert these back into sound. There's no information here about frequencies or musical pitches or anything like that, but you do have a rhythm, and you have a time dimension, and you have impulses of varying degrees. And so what I did was I linked this into a noise sample. So wherever there's a higher signal, there's more noise. Wherever there's a lower signal, there's less noise. And I also keyed it to a slight increase in frequency, so with the idea of coming up with something that would sound a bit like this. Not like that. Well, I'll just play the recording. Why do I need to imitate it? So this is Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. So that was the first technique that occurred to me for educing a heartbeat, because it's a variation in a particular parameter, blood pressure. So where there's more pressure, more noise, less pressure, less noise. It was a place to start. So we took this trace from a device called the sphygmograph, a human pulse recording made in 1860. And I tried doing that with it, and it ended up sounding like this. And it was a start. I mean, you've got an impulse there, a punch. And that's tied directly, indexically, to this person's heart beating back in the year 1860. When that heart beat, today, when you play this back, you hear an impulse because it beat. But it still didn't really seem to be doing justice to the trace. So you see this double bump there. It wasn't doing anything with that. You're just getting a single pulse. And so Dario was actually visiting me at home in Bloomington when I thought, well, let's try to run one of these through the software, just as I was doing with those old musical recordings, except I'll set the frequency range way, way, way down to the frequency range we associate with listening to heartbeats. And so I ran this through. I had no idea what it would sound like and was very excited by what I heard. So Dario was out making a phone call when I tried that for the first time. You came in. So what did you think when you heard that for the first time?
I thought we had succeeded. Or you had.
I'll head back over there.
Sorry. Yes. So Patrick now presented this whole incredible new opportunity to keep digging back and eventually to still trace up to Anne. But I was so inspired by just his general quest of inching back, that it became, I took it as a creative challenge. Like, was there some other inventive way to think back a little further? And, well, before I show you that, I wanted to just show you some of our discoveries that we're very fond of. They all have incredible stories behind them. All milestones that, if you're not looking for them, I don't know that anybody would have thought they were milestones. But they're all very important to Anne's story. Won't tell you about all of them, but we were discussing this concept of pushing back in time. And because of Patrick's research already on the German Moltke, right? It started to think, was there some equivalent with the heart? And we found something that we're very excited about. Could we find a heart that was also born in the 18th century, that would have been recorded in the 19th century, mostly forgotten about in the 20th, and now for the first time ever heard in the 21st century? It is a strange way to think about the passing of time and materials. But Johann, who nobody would remember otherwise, is our last link to the heart and the 18th century. Dr. Fish? I think it's something to say. And we're going to play it? Yeah, okay. So this is the first time 18th century pulse would be heard in the 21st century. No, it didn't work. Okay. Oh, there it goes. Well, we have another little glitch. Sorry. But anyway, what I would like to point out is that as Patrick has inspired this constant pushback, as we continually find, and he does as well, there's always another way to push back a little further. And as excited as we were to find Johann and try to paint a picture of who he was, just a few weeks ago, during another discussion, Patrick was able to find and locate another pushback. And this one's incredibly rare and really beautiful on a material level because it was a very rare case where a centenarian would have been recorded. Being 100 years old in 1870 would have been highly unusual already. He died just a few months after this tracing, but to add to the beauty of this, this is one of the first photographs of a heart moving over time. And this is a very unusual device, which I'll let Patrick explain better. But you have all these medias that are finding ways to talk to each other. Like, what's the history of the camera or the photograph with the history of physiology? It's not a topic you would immediately seem an obvious one to explore or think about. But then when you add the poetry to this quest of the ways humans have tried to find ways to document a beating heart over time, it's quite stunning to see a 100-year-old person's pulse moving by a beam of light being traced on photographic paper.
The technique that was used in this case, it was similar to the pressure cuff, but it was filled with mercury. And the mercury was then attached to a column that would rise and fall like the mercury in a barometer, so that if you moved a strip of photographically sensitized paper along behind it and shone a beam of light on it, wherever there was mercury, of course, it would not expose the surface, but wherever the tube was not full would become exposed. So essentially you'd get a photographic wavy line on the sheet of paper that would correspond to the fluctuations in the column of mercury. So a very clever way of using photography to make perhaps a more sensitive trace than could have been done, even with the seemingly very, very light human hair.
Right.
Now we're using light itself.
Yeah, light and hair are the materials that are vital to the history of the quest to record the heart, who would have expected such a thing? But the recording we just played you is the second one, using Patrick's method. And before we take a few questions, I just wanted to just further elaborate on, there it is, sorry.
And
that is
and think
Johan.
about this. This is the heart. This is
Johan.
Oh, okay.
So this is a hair traced in soot.
Let's say the other one are men born on January 8th of 1769. Just imagine, this is someone who would have been in his 20s during the French Revolution. So that other heart that we have a trace of there, that's a heart that would have probably beat a little bit faster at the news of the storming of the Bastille.
And something that is becoming apparent as we dig in more to the research is that, as you would expect, because we're talking about the heart, everything's more charged, more important. And something that I keep finding, and Patrick does too, that's so beautiful is that in the journals, the published papers of so many of these scientists, you end up realizing that a new portrait of life is happening through the heart tracings. And nothing was mundane because nobody had ever seen that action through the lens of a beating heart. So for example, eating chocolate. What does your heart look like? There's a tracing of it. We found having brandy, listening to music, walking up a flight of stairs. It's just this beautiful portrait of life, and there's tracings moving through time of people's hearts in normal actions of life. But something that we're both trying to piece together is this: could you actually tell the story of this line from birth to death? And so as of now, these are the tracings we've found that would slot into these crucial moments of life, moments before birth, moments after birth, and as far as we know, the only centenarian recorded, and as we pointed out, the earliest born human heart that we've ever found. So Patrick has his work has offered a new way of looking at this problem. And not only to trace the history, but to really reflect on the problem of erosion and decay as not hindering barriers, that we don't have to accept that the passing of time and decay forever erodes and erases information about who we are. And again, I relate that to Anne very much. And I'll just end by showing you how clever the Voyager team was in trying to deal with this problem of erosion, because of course that record that carries Anne's falling in love and a number of other things At the time, the team realized that one of the problems would be that it's basically moving at 39,000 miles per hour, being bombarded with micrometeorites for millions of years. So they did the best they could to estimate what the impact of a micrometeorite would be in deep areas of interstellar space. And just an example of what it's going through every second of the day as time's passing. But they made that case, the image I just showed you was the actual case that fits over the record, and they made it exactly 1 millimeter thicker than their best estimates of a micrometeorite impact crater hitting into it. So they're hoping that one buffer of 1 millimeter of gold is going to absorb the beating of these micrometeorites and not forever destroy the information embedded in those grooves. And so to me, again, this is a beautiful parallel with what Patrick does, because essentially, here's an example of a micrometeorite and a micrometeorite crater in a material that's been in space. And one of the ultimate sadnesses would be that record gets to wherever it's going, and those grooves have somehow been washed away. But Patrick's work offers inventive workarounds to this problem, which is what I find so hopeful about it when you put it in context with that story. So, I don't know if you have any remarks about that.
Well, sure. I certainly think that any intelligence that would find the golden record could probably manage to do something with even fairly distressed data. I mean, we're working with phonautograms, for instance, that were somewhat degraded over time, but really less than you might think. They're occasionally smudged and so forth, but certainly many of the inscriptions that I've worked with are quite heavily degraded, possibly not to the point of this type of constant pelting with micrometeors. But I do like to think that they would figure out some way of noise reduction and so on. I can sort of imagine if I were faced with a disk that was full of little craters like this, I would find a way of doing something with it. I think that the big question for me, though, would be what precisely the intelligence would choose to do with it, and if it would bear any resemblance to our own sense of what should be done with an LP or with a gramophone record. Just looking back at what we have done here, if you'd like to think of what we did with phonautograms and so forth as a model for this. Of course, Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville was not thinking that we would take his phonautograms and play them back as sound. That was not part of his project. The people whose pulse traces we've played back, I'm sure we're not thinking that they were making traces that in the 21st century would be brought back to life. Resurrected seems to be the term that people like to use for that. So we're taking these inscriptions and we're finding them to be very, very meaningful, and we're doing things to them to make them more meaningful. But what an alien intelligence would do with that kind of data, when perhaps they don't have auditory organs, perhaps they can't hear sound, but maybe they would take that waveform and decompose it into a spectrogram, and they would admire it as a beautiful image. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But if our work is any model, what they'll do will be intensely meaningful to them, mm-hmm. but it may take some form that we can't even begin to fathom.
Yes. So we'll take an end on that note, and just some other beautiful images. Patrick's the first to have heard that human voice, but also the human heart from the 19th century. And then, of course, here's an image of Anne's heart. But we could take maybe one or two questions. Dimby?
Patrick, just curious if those, your educed recordings were verbatim, or if they've been noise suppressed or signal enhanced?
I have not done any noise reduction on any of them, which is you hear the hiss that comes largely from imperfections in the paper and things of that sort. But I personally don't find that audio restoration helps make these more intelligible. It may be because my ear's used to it, but what you heard is exactly what was extracted from the images in all cases.
It's very cool.
Toby?
I'm thinking of that phrase, if these walls can speak. you give any examples of accidental recordings that are intelligible?
Well, I know that there's a lot of very provocative speculation about ways in which vibrations could have been recorded unintentionally long, long ago. Brushstrokes in paintings, chisels on clay pots, and so forth. And it all seems very plausible. In my own experience, it seems to be so difficult to extract a signal, even from cases in which Edward Leon Scott was trying to use his phonautograph to inscribe sound, that the idea that we could capture it from an accidental inscription and have it be meaningful and recognizable, that the chances seem somewhat slim to me. However, Dario and I have found one example that I like to think of as an unintentional sound recording that fits in very much to this project. Murray, who was one of the researchers that we found quite fascinating, attempted to record the pulse and heart phenomena in a number of different ways. But one thing that he used was a stethoscope. And the reason that he chose a stethoscope, he wanted to find some way of recording the heart that was equivalent to just pressing your hand on someone's chest. And so there was a recently invented stethoscope at that time that you could do that with. It basically had a lens made up of two membranes at the end, and you could press that against the chest and get a signal into a stethoscope. And he attached that to a phonautograph and made a trace of what came through it. And he thought of this really as capturing the movement, what you would feel. But it really was also a recording of heart sounds. I mean, it's what you would have heard through a stethoscope, and that is one that we have played back. But he wasn't really trying to record sound. So in that case, it really was an accidental recording of sound. It wasn't what he was aiming to record. And I suspect that if we are going to recover unintentional recordings of sound, they'll most likely come from cases where someone was really trying to record something else intentionally and just managed to get a little bit of sound in without knowing it.
Okay, I think one more question, and then we can, Dr. Fraser.
You know, it's fascinating that y'all are able to do this. You know, it's to hear these sounds from so long ago. And it's interesting that the French were sort of pioneers in learning with that very primitive, it was made out of wood actually, stethoscope, diagnosing heart disease by sounds. And it was a real art, and it was something, when I was a medical student, you know, it was fascinating. The old doctors could listen and say, well, this is, French had a great saying, the cry of the heart. You know, they could, it's better in French, but once you have some experience, you know what they're talking about, and it was a real art, and it was diagnostic. And the early heart surgeons, Dr. Cooley, of course, was a real pioneer in that. He would go in and operate on these children on the basis of what they heard, and they were nearly invariably right. Occasionally they weren't, but one of the tragedies is we don't have any. Actually, most of the students don't even listen to hearts now. You know, they just get an echo. And it's sort of an interesting evolution. And the other thing, it would be interesting if we could find a pathological heartbeat somewhere along the line, because all of these are roughly normal heart sounds that y'all have recorded, which is fascinating. But it'd be nice if we.
Do you think you could diagnose based from some of these recordings?
Well, you could. Yeah, I mean,
Well, we do have some.
I mean, you have some different, well, you know, with the babies and these sort of things, and those are fascinating as well. But the other thing, of course, is, you know, we're learning new ways to support the heart, and we use it with a continuous pump that doesn't have a heartbeat. And of course, patients with these are perfectly normal. So it is a bit discouraging to the artist, I suppose, to realize that the heart doesn't have quite the emotional impact that we've felt so long. But But nonetheless, it is also true that we are learning the art of diagnosing malfunction of these devices by listening to them. And so we're sort of making a curve, because we now, instead of going, where, it goes, where, once you hear that, you know there's problems. And so I really congratulate you.
That's why we need an
work.
archive of your devices as sounds.
Yeah, we're working on that.
Yes.
That'd be a very great addition, I think, to medical science. And again, but all of this, again, reminds you of the fact, which I'll have to beat back into the students, who, we're all carrying cells that came out of the mud, a million years ago. We're still carrying them. And we're carrying this heartbeat as we're just borrowed it from our predecessors, and we're carrying it along.
Yes, and this research allows us to pull the baton back further than we thought, or hand it off even more.
Well, it'd be good if we could find one of those old French. I bet they bound to have done it somewhere, some pathological tracing of a child with congenital heart disease.
We've got some.
Yeah, I will show them to you. I just haven't stressed those, but of course that's what you would be interested in, is the the early disease images of disease. We have found some.
There was actually one earlier figure in the 18th century who didn't record actual heartbeats, but he used musical notation to notate irregular heartbeats. So that might be an interesting thing to look at. See if you can look at that musical notation and say, oh, I know what's going on there.
Well, thank you so much. And Patrick's incredible. I hope